Caleb Thornton found two children standing over a grave they had dug themselves, their hands still raw from burying their father alone 5 days ago. The promise he made them under that oak tree would destroy the solitary life he had built and give him everything he never knew he needed. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust of the Texas Panhandle had a way of settling into everything: clothes, hair, the creases around a man's eyes, but nothing prepared Caleb Thornton for what he found that September afternoon when he rode onto the abandoned Harper homestead. Two children stood beneath the sprawling branches of a massive oak tree, their small hands clasped together, their faces streaked with dried tears and fresh dirt. They couldn't have been more than 8 years old, mirror images of each other with auburn hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. The boy wore suspenders over a faded green shirt, and the girl had braids that hung past her shoulders, both of them looking at him with expressions that held far too much knowing for children their age. Caleb reined in his horse and swung down from the saddle, his boots sending up small clouds of dust as they hit the parched earth. He had been riding the property line between his ranch and the Harper place, checking on reports of downed fence posts, when he noticed the smoke from the cabin's chimney had gone cold for the 3rd day running. In this country, cold chimneys meant trouble, and trouble left unattended had a way of spreading like wildfire. The little girl spoke first, her voice carrying across the distance with startling clarity. "We buried Papa under the big oak." Her brother nodded solemnly beside her, his chin trembling despite the brave set of his jaw. "He told us to dig deep so the coyotes wouldn't bother him none." Caleb felt something twist in his chest, a pain he thought he had buried years ago beneath layers of hard work and harder whiskey. He removed his hat slowly, pressing it against his heart in the way his own father had taught him to show respect for the dead and the grieving. The gesture felt inadequate against the enormity of what these children were telling him, but it was all he had to offer in that moment. The oak tree behind them was ancient, its trunk wider than a wagon wheel, its branches spreading outward like the arms of a grandmother gathering her family close. Beneath those branches, he could see the freshly turned earth, a mound of brown soil that spoke of small hands working through blisters and exhaustion to honor their father's final request. A simple wooden cross had been fashioned from fence posts, standing crooked but determined against the prairie wind. "How long ago?" Caleb asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "When did your papa pass?" The boy looked at his sister, some silent communication passing between them that only twins seemed capable of understanding. 4 days, he said finally. "Maybe 5. We lost count after the second night." Caleb's mind raced through the implications. 4 or 5 days alone on a homestead with no adults, no protection, nothing but each other and whatever supplies remained in the cabin. The Harper place was a good 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, and the town of Dusty Creek sat another 10 beyond that. These children had survived on their own through fear and grief and the relentless Texas sun, and they had done so without a single soul knowing they needed help. He raised his hand slowly, palm outward, the gesture of an oath he had not intended to make until the words were already leaving his lips. "I'm going to help you, I promise you that. Whatever you need, whatever comes next, you won't face it alone." The girl's lower lip quivered, but she did not cry. Her brother's hand tightened around hers, knuckles going white with the pressure of holding himself together. They had clearly exhausted their tears days ago, leaving behind only the hollow strength that comes when crying no longer brings relief. "I'm Caleb Thornton," he continued, taking a careful step forward. "I own the ranch to the east, the Circle T. I knew your papa some. He was a good man, a hard worker." This was partially true. Samuel Harper had been a quiet sort, keeping mostly to himself since arriving in the territory 3 years prior with his wife and infant twins. Caleb had shared a drink with him once at the saloon in Dusty Creek, enough to know he was decent folk trying to make an honest living on unforgiving land. He had heard through town gossip that Harper's wife had died of fever the previous winter, leaving Samuel to raise the children alone. Now Samuel was gone too, and these 2 small souls were all that remained of a family that had come west seeking opportunity and found only heartbreak. The girl finally released her brother's hand and took a tentative step toward Caleb. "I'm Lily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is my brother Lucas. Papa always said if something happened to him, we should find someone trustworthy and tell them the truth. He said honest folks help each other in this country." The boy, Lucas, watched Caleb with eyes that held suspicion alongside hope. "Papa also said not everyone who seems kind actually is. He said we had to be careful who we trusted." "Smart man, your papa," Caleb replied, settling his hat back on his head. "And you're right to be careful, but I'm going to prove myself to you one day at a time. Right now, though, I need to know some things. When did you last eat? When did you last have clean water?" The twins exchanged another of their silent glances. "There's some hardtack left," Lucas admitted. "And we've been getting water from the creek, but Papa always said to boil it first, and we ran out of kindling yesterday." Caleb nodded, his mind already cataloging what needed to be done. First, he would get these children fed and watered properly. Then he would pay his respects at Samuel Harper's grave, saying whatever words of comfort a rough rancher could manage. After that, he would need to figure out what came next, whether there was family to contact, what would happen to the homestead, and most importantly, what would become of these brave little souls who had buried their father with their own hands and waited for someone to find them. He had not asked for this responsibility. He had spent the last decade building the Circle T into something respectable, working from before dawn until after dark, filling his days with enough labor to keep the memories at bay. He had a bunkhouse full of ranch hands, hundreds of cattle, and more land than he could ride across in a single day. What he did not have was family. What he did not have was anyone who depended on him for anything more than a paycheck and a fair shake. But looking at these children, at the dirt under their fingernails and the grief in their eyes, Caleb Thornton felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. It was not obligation or pity, though both of those were present. It was something deeper, something that recognized in their loss an echo of his own buried pain. Something that whispered this was not coincidence, but purpose. The Texas sun beat down on them all, the grieving twins, the weathered rancher, the fresh grave beneath the ancient oak, and somewhere in that moment, beneath that tree that had witnessed generations of life and death on the unforgiving prairie, a new chapter began to write itself in the dust and determination of the American frontier. The cabin was smaller than Caleb had expected, a single room divided by hanging blankets into sleeping and living areas. The hearth sat cold and dark, ashes spilling onto the rough-hewn floor where small footprints marked the children's movements over the past days. A table built from split logs held the remnants of their meager meals, crumbs of hardtack, an empty tin that had once contained beans, a jar of preserves scraped clean to the glass. These children had rationed carefully, stretching what little they had with the wisdom of those who understood that survival meant thinking beyond the immediate hunger. Caleb set his saddlebags on the table and began unpacking what supplies he had brought for his own day's ride. Jerky, a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, 2 apples that had survived the journey only slightly bruised. It was not much, but the way the twins' eyes widened at the sight of it told him everything he needed to know about how close they had come to true desperation. "Eat slow," he cautioned as he divided the food between them. "Your stomachs aren't used to much right now. Too fast and you'll make yourselves sick." Lily took a small bite of apple, her eyes closing briefly in something like ecstasy. Lucas was more restrained, watching Caleb even as he chewed, still measuring this stranger who had appeared in their lives like an answer to prayers they had been too exhausted to speak aloud. While the children ate, Caleb busied himself with rebuilding the fire. He found the woodpile behind the cabin depleted but not empty, gathered an armful of split logs, and soon had flames crackling in the hearth. The warmth seemed to transform the space, chasing shadows from the corners and bringing a semblance of normalcy to a home that had known too much sorrow. "Tell me about your papa," he said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. "Tell me what happened." The twins looked at each other, and this time it was Lucas who spoke. "He got sick about 2 weeks ago, started coughing, couldn't catch his breath proper. Lily wanted to ride for the doctor, but Papa said no, said it would pass." He paused, his young face twisting with the memory. It didn't pass. It got worse every day until he couldn't get out of bed no more. He told us what to do, Lily added quietly. Made us promise to bury him proper under the oak tree where Mama's flowers grow in spring. Said that's where he wanted to be, close to where he could watch over the land and wait for us. Caleb felt the weight of those words settle into his bones. Samuel Harper had known he was dying and had spent his final hours preparing his children for a world without him. He had given them instructions, imparted whatever wisdom he could manage through the fever and the failing breath, and then he had trusted them to carry on. The courage that must have required, both from the dying father and the children left behind, was almost too much to comprehend. You did right by him, Caleb said firmly, both of you. He would be proud of how you handled things. Lucas's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down his cheeks though he made no sound. Lily moved closer to her brother, wrapping her arm around his shoulders in a gesture that spoke of countless times she had offered this same comfort. They were a unit, these two, forged by shared experience into something stronger than either could be alone. The afternoon wore on as Caleb worked to set the cabin to rights. He hauled water from the creek and set it to boil, swept the floor clean of accumulated dust and debris, and took inventory of what supplies remained in the small root cellar beneath the trapdoor in the corner. There was enough to last perhaps another week if carefully managed. Potatoes sprouting eyes, a sack of flour that had begun to turn, salt pork that was still edible if not appetizing. The Harpers had not been wealthy, but they had been prepared for the lean times that frontier life inevitably brought. As evening approached, Caleb faced a decision he had been avoiding. He could not leave these children alone overnight, not after what they had endured. But staying meant committing himself further to their welfare, entangling his life with theirs in ways that would be difficult to undo. He thought of his empty ranch house, the silence that greeted him each night when the work was done, the bottle of whiskey that had become his only companion in the dark hours. "I'm going to stay tonight," he announced, his voice brooking no argument. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next, but for now, you need someone here." The relief that washed over both children's faces confirmed he had made the right choice. Lily's shoulders dropped from their rigid position, and Lucas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. They were exhausted, Caleb realized, not just physically but emotionally, held together by nothing more than willpower and the desperate hope that help would eventually arrive. He prepared a simple meal from the supplies he had brought, supplemented by potatoes from the cellar. It was not fancy, but it was hot and filling, and the twins ate with an appetite that suggested they had not had a proper meal since their father's decline began. Afterward, as the fire burned low and the night sounds of the prairie filtered through the cabin walls, Caleb found himself telling them about the Circle T. He spoke of the cattle that roamed his pastures, the horses in his stable, the bunkhouse where a dozen ranch hands lived and worked. He described the main house with its stone fireplace and wooden floors, the porch that looked out over rolling hills dotted with mesquite and juniper. He told them about Cookie, his cantankerous but talented cook, and about his foreman Hector, who had been with him since the beginning and knew more about ranching than any three men combined. The twins listened with rapt attention, their eyes growing heavy as his voice washed over them like a lullaby. By the time he finished describing the swimming hole where the creek widened into a natural pool, both children had fallen asleep where they sat, slumped against each other in the unconscious trust of youth. Caleb carried them one at a time to the small bed they shared, tucking the worn quilt around their thin shoulders. Standing there in the dim light, watching them sleep peacefully for perhaps the first time in weeks, he felt something shift inside his chest. The promise he had made beneath the oak tree had been spoken in haste, driven by instinct rather than intention. But now, in the quiet of this humble cabin, that promise began to feel less like an obligation and more like a calling. Morning came with the reluctant gray light of an overcast sky, clouds gathering on the horizon in a way that promised rain before nightfall. Caleb had slept fitfully in the chair by the hearth, his hand never straying far from the rifle he had brought in from his saddle. The prairie held dangers beyond human comprehension. Mountain lions, wolves, desperate men driven to robbery by hard times, and he would not leave these children unprotected even in sleep. The twins woke within moments of each other, some invisible thread connecting them even in unconsciousness. Lucas stirred first, his eyes snapping open with the wariness of a creature who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. When he saw Caleb still sitting by the fire, something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Lily followed, rubbing sleep from her eyes and immediately looking for her brother, relaxing only when she confirmed he remained beside her. Caleb had already prepared breakfast, the last of his jerky, reconstituted into a passable stew with potatoes and wild onions he had spotted growing near the creek. The children ate without complaint, their table manners suggesting that Samuel Harper had insisted on certain standards even in this rough country. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleaned with sand and water, Caleb sat them down at the table and spoke plainly. "We need to go to town today," he explained. "There are things that have to be done proper, registering your papa's passing, seeing if there's any family we should contact, figuring out what happens to this homestead. I know it's hard, but these things can't wait." Lily's face paled at the mention of family. "Papa never talked about anyone," she said quietly. "He said it was just us now, that we were all each other needed." Lucas nodded in agreement. "Mama had a sister somewhere back east, but Papa said she wanted nothing to do with us after Mama married him. Said she thought Mama was making a mistake coming out west. This was both a complication and a simplification. If there was no family willing to claim these children, the territory would have to decide their fate. That meant the orphanage in San Antonio, a grim institution that Caleb had heard stories about. Overcrowded, underfunded, a place where children were treated as problems to be managed rather than souls to be nurtured. The thought of Lily and Lucas ending up there, separated perhaps, their spirits broken by institutional indifference, sent a cold fury through his veins. "We'll figure it out," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "One step at a time. For now, gather whatever you want to bring with you. We'll lock up the cabin and head to Dusty Creek." The twins moved through the small space with the efficiency of children accustomed to making do with little. Lucas collected a worn Bible that had clearly belonged to his father, its leather cover softened by years of handling. Lily gathered a small wooden box that contained, she explained, her mother's wedding ring and a lock of her hair. These meager treasures represented everything that remained of their family's history, and they carried them with the reverence such artifacts deserved. The ride to town took most of the morning, the twins sharing Caleb's horse while he walked alongside, leading the animal by its reins. They passed through landscapes that shifted from brown prairie grass to scrubland dotted with mesquite, the terrain rising and falling in gentle waves that seemed to echo the uncertainty of their journey. The children spoke little, their eyes fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something they had lost and could never quite find again. Dusty Creek emerged from the landscape like a mirage given substance, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church steeple rising above the rest, the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer ringing through the morning air. It was not a large town, perhaps 500 souls on a good day, but it served as the hub of commerce and community for the ranchers and homesteaders scattered across 100 miles of territory. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Caleb Thornton was known in Dusty Creek, respected as a man who paid his debts, kept his word, and minded his own business. The sight of him walking into town with two bedraggled children riding his horse set tongues wagging before they had even reached the sheriff's office. By the time they dismounted in front of the weathered wooden building, a small crowd had gathered on the boardwalk, curiosity overcoming the pretense of disinterest. Sheriff Tom Bellamy was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything the frontier could produce. He listened to Caleb's account of finding the children, his expression growing more solemn with each detail. When the story reached its conclusion, the grave beneath the oak tree, the children's days of solitary survival, he let out a long breath and shook his head slowly. "Damn shame," he muttered, glancing at the twins who sat quietly in the corner of his office, their hands clasped together as they had been when Caleb first found them. Samuel Harper was good people, kept to himself, but never caused trouble. His wife's death hit him hard, everyone could see that, but he kept going for those kids. "Is there any family?" Caleb asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Anyone who might take them in." Bellamy consulted a ledger on his desk, running his finger down columns of names and dates. "Harper listed next of kin as his wife, Margaret," he said finally. "No one else. If she had family, he never mentioned them to me." The sheriff's eyes moved to the children, then back to Caleb, something calculating in his gaze. "You know what this means, Thornton. Without family, they become wards of the territory. That means the orphanage down in San Antonio, unless someone steps forward to take responsibility." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Caleb felt the weight of the promise he had made beneath the oak tree pressing down on his shoulders, demanding to be honored. He thought of the empty rooms in his ranch house, the silence that had become his constant companion, the life he had built that suddenly seemed hollow and incomplete. What would stepping forward involve? He heard himself ask. Sheriff Bellamy leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning beneath his weight as he considered Caleb's question. It was not asked lightly, and they both knew it. Taking responsibility for orphaned children in the territory was not a simple matter of goodwill. It carried legal obligations, financial commitments, and social expectations that would reshape a man's entire existence. "You'd need to petition the territorial court for guardianship," Bellamy explained, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone who had navigated these waters before. "Judge Crawford comes through every 6 weeks or so. He'd want to see that you can provide for them proper food, shelter, education, the basics. He'd also want to know your intentions, whether you're looking to adopt them outright or just serve as guardian until they come of age." Caleb absorbed this information, his mind racing through the implications. The Circle T was prosperous enough to support 2 additional mouths without strain. He had room in his house, resources to spare, and the means to give these children opportunities their father could never have provided. What he lacked was any experience with raising children, any knowledge of what they needed beyond the material basics. And if no one steps forward, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Bellamy's expression darkened. "Then I'm obligated to contact the territorial authorities in San Antonio. They'll send someone to collect the children and transport them to the state orphan asylum." He paused, glancing at the twins to ensure they could not hear. "Between us, Thornton, that place is no fit home for any child. I've seen what comes out of there, broken spirits, hard eyes, kids who've learned that the world has no place for them. These 2 deserve better." The twins sat motionless in the corner, their attention seemingly fixed on the floor. But Caleb caught the slight tilt of Lily's head that suggested she was listening to every word. Children learned early on the frontier to gather information however they could. Their survival often depended on understanding the conversations adults thought they could not hear. "How long do I have to decide?" Caleb asked. "A few days, maybe a week before I'm required to file the paperwork." Bellamy's eyes held something like hope. "But Thornton, if you're serious about this, don't wait too long. The bureaucracy moves slow until it doesn't, and once those children are in the system, getting them out becomes a fight most men aren't willing to wage." Caleb nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing even as doubts swirled through his mind. He rose from his chair and crossed to where the twins sat, lowering himself to one knee so he could meet their eyes directly. They looked up at him with expressions that held fear and hope in equal measure, 2 children who had already lost everything and now faced the possibility of losing what little remained. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "And I need you to answer me honest, the way your papa would have wanted. Do you trust me enough to come stay at my ranch while we figure things out? I'm not promising anything yet, but I want to give us all time to see if this could work." Lily looked at her brother, that silent communication passing between them once more. Lucas studied Caleb's face with an intensity that belied his years, searching for something, deception perhaps, or the hollow promises that adults so often made to children they had no intention of keeping. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he gave a small nod. "Papa said you could tell a man's character by how he treated those who couldn't do anything for him," Lucas said carefully. "You didn't have to help us. You didn't have to stay last night or bring us to town or ask what stepping forward would involve. You could have just ridden on and left us to whatever came next. But you didn't, Lily added softly. You took off your hat and made a promise, and you've kept it so far. Papa always said that's what matters most, keeping the promises you make. The simple faith in their words struck Caleb harder than any blow he had ever received. These children, who had every reason to distrust the world and everyone in it, were choosing to believe in him based on nothing more than a few hours of kindness and a gesture of respect beneath an oak tree. The responsibility of that trust settled onto his shoulders like a physical weight, but it was not unwelcome. For the first time in longer than he could remember, someone needed him for more than his land or his cattle or his ability to pay wages on time. Then it's settled, he said, rising to his feet. At least for now. We'll head to the ranch today, get you settled in proper, and take things one day at a time. The relief that washed over their faces made the decision feel right, in a way that logic and reason could never have achieved. Sheriff Bellamy watched the exchange with approval in his eyes, already reaching for the forms that would begin the process of legal guardianship. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of bureaucratic necessities. Caleb filed a preliminary petition with the sheriff's office, provided a statement about the circumstances of Samuel Harper's death, and arranged for a proper death certificate to be issued based on the children's account and his own observations of the gravesite. The townspeople who had gathered to witness this unusual drama gradually dispersed, though Caleb knew their whispers would spread the news to every corner of the county before nightfall. Before leaving town, he stopped at the general store to purchase supplies, new clothes for the children, whose garments were worn thin and too small, food enough to stock the ranch house pantry, and small luxuries he hoped might bring some comfort. Penny candy for sweetness, a picture book for Lily, a pocket knife for Lucas. These were not extravagant gifts, but the twins received them with wonder that spoke of lives where such things had been rare treasures. The ride back to the Circle T took them past the Harper homestead, and Caleb paused long enough for the children to say goodbye to their father's grave. They stood beneath the oak tree's spreading branches, their heads bowed in silent prayer, and Caleb hung back to give them privacy. When they returned to the wagon, their eyes were red, but their shoulders were straighter, as if they had received some final blessing from the man who lay beneath that freshly turned earth. The Circle T emerged from the prairie like a kingdom unto itself, sprawling across the landscape with a grandeur that made the twins gasp audibly from their seat in the wagon. The main house was a two-story structure built from limestone and cedar, its wide porch wrapping around three sides like welcoming arms. Behind it stood the bunkhouse, the barn, the stables, and a dozen smaller outbuildings that spoke of an operation far larger than anything they had known on their father's modest homestead. Ranch hands paused in their work to watch the wagon approach, their curiosity evident in the way they straightened from their tasks and exchanged glances. Caleb Thornton returning from town with two children was not something any of them had anticipated, and the questions forming behind their eyes would need answering before the day was through. Hector Rodriguez met them at the main house, his weathered face creasing with surprise as he took in the unexpected passengers. The foreman had worked alongside Caleb for nearly 15 years, had helped him build the Circle T from a struggling operation into one of the most successful ranches in the territory. In all that time, he had never seen his employer show interest in anything beyond cattle, horses, and the occasional bottle of whiskey consumed in solitary silence. "Boss," Hector said carefully, his accent lending music to the single word. "You want to tell me what's going on here?" Caleb climbed down from the wagon and helped the twins descend, his hands steady despite the uncertainty churning in his gut. "This is Lily and Lucas Harper," he said simply. "Their father passed away, and they've got no one else. They'll be staying with us for a while." The explanation was inadequate, and everyone present knew it, but Hector had the wisdom to recognize when questions should wait. He tipped his hat to the children with grave courtesy, his dark eyes softening as he took in their travel-worn appearance and the way they clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. "Welcome to the Circle T," he said gently. "You must be hungry after the long ride. Cookie's got supper on, and there's plenty for everyone." The main house's interior reflected the personality of its owner. Sparse but quality furnishings, practical layouts, nothing wasted on frivolous decoration. Yet, there was warmth in the stone fireplace that dominated the main room, comfort in the leather chairs positioned to catch the evening light, a sense of permanence that the Harper cabin had never possessed. The twins stood in the entryway, their eyes wide as they tried to absorb the fact that this magnificent place might become their home. Caleb showed them to a room on the second floor that had sat empty since the house was built, its furniture draped in sheets that he pulled away to reveal a bed large enough for both children, a dresser with a mirror, a small desk positioned beneath a window that looked out over the rolling hills. Dust motes swirled in the afternoon light as he opened the curtains, and for a moment, the room felt like a stage awaiting its players. "This will be yours," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "We can fix it up however you like, add whatever you need." "It's not much yet, but it's perfect," Lily interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. She moved to the window, pressing her palm against the glass as if to confirm that the view was real. "Papa always talked about having a room with a window like this. He said someday, when the homestead started paying off, he'd build Mama a house where she could watch the sunrise every morning." Lucas remained near the door, his posture guarded despite the wonder in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked abruptly. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. Why would you give us all this?" The question deserved an honest answer, and Caleb took his time formulating one. He crossed to the bed and sat on its edge, bringing himself closer to the children's eye level, a habit he had developed over the past days that seemed to put them at ease. "When I was about your age," he began slowly, "my own father died. Fever took him, same as it took yours. My mother had passed birthing me, so there was no one left. I spent 3 years in an orphanage before running away to make my own way in the world." He paused, the memories rising unbidden. Cold nights, empty bellies, the casual cruelty of those who saw homeless children as nuisances rather than human beings. "I swore back then that if I ever had the means to help a child avoid that fate, I would." The confession hung in the air between them, reshaping their understanding of this gruff rancher who had appeared in their lives like Providence made flesh. Lily's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and even Lucas's defensive posture softened slightly as he processed what he had heard. "So this is charity," the boy said, but the word lacked the edge it might have carried moments before. "No," Caleb replied firmly. "This is family looking out for family, or it could be if you'll give it a chance. I'm not trying to replace your papa, no one could do that. But I'm offering you a place to belong, people who'll care for you, a future that doesn't involve institutional walls and the pity of strangers." Supper that evening was a subdued affair, the twins picking at their food despite Cookie's best efforts to tempt them with roasted chicken and fresh biscuits. The ranch hands had been told a simplified version of events, and had accepted the children's presence with the pragmatic adaptability that frontier life demanded. There were curious glances but no intrusive questions, a courtesy that Caleb appreciated more than he could express. After the meal, he sat on the porch with Hector, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Texas sky. The foreman rolled a cigarette with practiced fingers, the flame of his match briefly illuminating features that held both concern and something that might have been approval. "You sure about this, boss?" Hector asked quietly. "Taking on 2 kids is no small thing. Changes everything about how you live your life." Caleb considered the question, gazing out at the land he had spent 15 years building into something meaningful. "Maybe everything needs changing," he said finally. "Maybe I've been living half a life without knowing it." The first weeks at the Circle T passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. The twins moved through their new surroundings with the cautious curiosity of wild creatures learning to trust, each day bringing small revelations that gradually transformed the ranch house from a stranger's dwelling into something approaching home. Lily developed an immediate fascination with the kitchen garden that Cookie maintained behind the main house, spending hours among the tomatoes and herbs with a dedication that reminded Caleb of her father's reputation for meticulous work. Lucas gravitated toward the stables, his natural affinity for horses emerging as he helped the ranch hands with grooming and feeding, his small hands gentle on the animals' coats. Caleb watched these developments with a mixture of pride and uncertainty, still unsure of his role in the children's lives. He had never been a father, had never imagined himself capable of the patience and tenderness that raising children required. Yet he found himself adapting in ways that surprised him, rising earlier to share breakfast with the twins, returning from the range in time for supper, spending evenings by the fire reading aloud from the books he had accumulated over the years but never found time to enjoy. The news of his guardianship petition spread through the county like wildfire, carried on the tongues of gossips and the genuine concern of neighbors. Opinions varied widely. Some praised his Christian charity, while others whispered about ulterior motives, about a bachelor rancher who surely must have hidden reasons for taking in 2 young children. The speculation bothered Caleb less than he had expected. He had long since stopped caring what others thought of him, but he worried about its effect on the twins, who had already endured enough judgment and pity to last a lifetime. It was Martha Hendricks who brought the first real challenge to their fragile new arrangement. The widow Hendricks ran the boarding house in Dusty Creek and considered herself the moral guardian of the entire county, a position she wielded with the authority of someone who had confused nosiness with righteousness. She arrived at the Circle T one afternoon in a buggy driven by her long-suffering nephew, her face set in lines of determined concern. "Mr. Thornton," she announced, before her feet had even touched the ground, "I've come to discuss the welfare of those poor Harper children." Caleb met her on the porch, positioning himself between the visitor and the door with deliberate casualness. "Mrs. Hendricks, what brings you all the way out here?" The woman drew herself up to her full height, which was not considerable but somehow managed to convey impressive indignation. "It has come to my attention that you are housing 2 minor children without proper supervision. A bachelor household is no place for young ones, especially a girl approaching a delicate age. Tongues are wagging, Mr. Thornton, and not kindly." Behind him, Caleb heard the soft creak of the screen door and knew without looking that the twins had emerged onto the porch. He felt rather than saw them take their positions on either side of him, their small bodies rigid with the tension of children who had learned to recognize threats in adult voices. "Mrs. Hendricks," he said evenly, "these children have a roof over their heads, food in their bellies, and people who care about their well-being. What exactly is your concern?" The woman's eyes narrowed as she took in the tableau before her, the tall rancher flanked by 2 fierce-eyed children who showed no sign of the cowering gratitude she had apparently expected. "My concern, Mr. Thornton, is propriety. A man alone with children who are not his own, no woman in the household to provide proper guidance, no church attendance that anyone has witnessed." She sniffed pointedly. "The Ladies' Auxiliary has discussed the matter, and we believe the children would be better served in a more suitable environment." Lucas stepped forward before Caleb could respond, his young voice carrying an authority that belied his years. "Our papa trusted Mr. Thornton to look after us," he said firmly. "He was a good man, our papa, and he would have known if Mr. Thornton was anything other than honorable. You didn't come to help us when papa was sick. You didn't come when we were alone and scared. Mr. Thornton did." The accusation landed with visible impact. Martha Hendricks' face flushed red, her composure cracking under the weight of a child's simple truth. She sputtered for a moment, searching for a response that would restore her moral authority, but Lily spoke before she could find one. "We're happy here," the girl said quietly, her hand finding Caleb's and holding tight. "For the first time since Papa died, we feel safe. Please don't try to take that away from us." The raw honesty in her voice seemed to deflate whatever righteous momentum had carried Martha Hendricks to their doorstep. She looked at the children, really looked at them, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite shame, but perhaps the first stirrings of doubt about the crusade she had appointed herself to lead. Caleb seized the moment of uncertainty. "Mrs. Hendricks, I appreciate your concern for the children's welfare. Truly I do, but I've filed proper guardianship papers with Judge Crawford, and I intend to provide these children with everything they need to grow up healthy and happy. If the Ladies' Auxiliary wants to help, they're welcome to contribute it to the Children's Education Fund or donate clothes they've outgrown. But I won't have anyone suggesting that what we're building here is anything less than a proper family." The word hung in the air between them, family, carrying weight that surprised even Caleb. He had not planned to say it, had not consciously thought of their arrangement in those terms, but once spoken, it felt true in a way that mere guardianship never could. Martha Hendricks departed shortly thereafter, her moral certainty considerably diminished, though Caleb harbored no illusions that she would abandon her campaign entirely. There would be more challenges ahead, more people who questioned his fitness to raise these children, more obstacles thrown in the path of the life they were building together. But as he watched the widow's buggy disappear down the road, the twins still standing beside him on the porch, he felt something he had not experienced in years. He felt ready for whatever came next. Autumn arrived with a vengeance that year, cold winds sweeping down from the north and stripping the trees of their remaining leaves. The ranch prepared for winter with the practiced efficiency of an operation that had survived many such seasons. But this year carried a different energy. For the first time there were children to consider, young ones who needed warm coats and sturdy boots, school books and lessons, the countless small necessities that parents took for granted but bachelor ranchers had never learned to anticipate. Caleb threw himself into these preparations with the same determination he brought to everything else, riding into town to purchase winter supplies and consulting with the school teacher about curriculum for children who had received only sporadic education on their father's homestead. Miss Eleanor Crane was a severe woman in her 50s who had been teaching the children of Dusty Creek for nearly 3 decades, and she regarded Caleb's sudden interest in education with undisguised suspicion. "Most ranchers don't concern themselves with book learning," she observed during his first visit to the small schoolhouse. "They figure children learn what they need from working the land. Most ranchers don't have 2 bright children who deserve every opportunity to make something of themselves," Caleb replied evenly. "Their father valued education. I intend to honor that." Something in his tone seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly and began discussing the assessments she would need to conduct to determine where the twins stood academically. Lucas, it emerged, had a natural facility for mathematics that far exceeded his age, while Lily possessed a vocabulary and reading comprehension that suggested someone had spent considerable time nurturing her love of words. Samuel Harper, for all his struggles to make the homestead profitable, had clearly invested heavily in his children's minds. The twins began attending school in early October, riding into town 3 days a week on a gentle mare that Caleb had selected specifically for her calm temperament. They returned each afternoon full of stories about their classmates, their lessons, the small dramas of childhood society that Caleb listened to with an attention that surprised even himself. He found himself caring about which children had been kind to them, which had been cruel, what they were learning, and how they felt about learning it. It was during one of these evening conversations that Lucas asked the question Caleb had been dreading. "Are you going to adopt us?" The boy's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes held an intensity that revealed how much the answer mattered. Caleb set down the harness he had been mending and gave the question the consideration it deserved. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for the following week, Judge Crawford having finally arrived for his circuit through the territory. The outcome was far from certain. There were still those in town who questioned the propriety of the arrangement, and judges were known to be unpredictable in matters involving children's welfare. "I want to," he said honestly. "If the judge approves the guardianship, and if you both want it, then yes, I want to make this permanent." Lily looked up from the sampler she had been embroidering, a skill Cookie had been teaching her in the evenings. "What if the judge says no? What happens to us then?" The fear in her voice cut Caleb deeper than any knife. He crossed to where the children sat and knelt before them, taking one of each of their hands in his own. "Then we fight," he said firmly. "We appeal, we petition, we do whatever it takes. I made a promise to you under that oak tree, and I meant every word. No judge, no busybody from town, no force on this earth is going to take you away from me if I have any say in the matter." The fierceness of his own words surprised him, but their truth was undeniable. Somewhere in the past weeks, these children had stopped being obligations and become his own, not through blood or law, but through the thousands of small moments that wove lives together, shared meals and bedtime stories, scraped knees bandaged and nightmares soothed, the gradual building of trust that transformed strangers into family. Lucas studied Caleb's face with that searching intensity that had become familiar. "You really mean that, don't you? This isn't just charity or Christian duty. You actually want us." "I actually want you," Caleb confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you. Not because I feel sorry for you or because I'm trying to be noble, but because you've made this house feel like a home for the first time since I built it. Because I can't imagine going back to the silence that used to fill these rooms." Lily's arms were around his neck before he could say more, her small body shaking with sobs that seemed to release months of accumulated fear and grief. Lucas held back a moment longer, the wariness that had protected him through so much hardship slow to surrender. But then he too moved forward, and Caleb found himself holding both children as if they were the most precious things in the world, because they were. The week before the hearing passed with agonizing slowness. Caleb found himself unable to concentrate on ranch work, his mind constantly circling back to the upcoming judgment and all the ways it could go wrong. Hector took over most of the daily operations without being asked, managing the hands and the cattle with the competence that had made him invaluable for 15 years. The night before they were due to appear before Judge Crawford, Caleb sat on the porch watching the stars wheel overhead, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The children had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted by the nervous energy that had pervaded the household, but sleep eluded him entirely. He thought about the promise he had made beneath the oak tree, the simple words that had changed everything. He thought about the life he had built alone, the success that had felt increasingly hollow with each passing year. He thought about what it would mean to be a father, truly a father, responsible for shaping two young lives into the adults they would someday become. The weight of it was terrifying. The rightness of it was undeniable. The Dusty Creek Courthouse was a modest building of whitewashed adobe, its interior dim and cool despite the autumn sun blazing outside. Caleb arrived early with the twins, all three of them dressed in their finest clothes, the children in new outfits he had purchased specifically for this occasion, himself in a suit he had not worn since his mother's funeral decades ago. The fabric felt strange against his skin, too formal for a man accustomed to denim and leather, but appearances mattered in courtrooms, and he would not give Judge Crawford any reason to question his seriousness. The chamber filled gradually with interested parties and curious onlookers. Sheriff Bellamy sat near the front, ready to provide testimony about the circumstances of Samuel Harper's death and the children's discovery. Miss Crane had come to speak about the twins' academic progress and their adjustment to school life. Even Hector had made the journey, uncomfortable in borrowed church clothes, but determined to support his employer in whatever way he could. Martha Hendricks was there as well, seated with several members of her ladies' auxiliary, their faces arranged in expressions of concerned righteousness. Caleb noted their presence without surprise. He had expected the opposition and had prepared accordingly. What he had not expected was the man who entered just before the proceedings began, a tall figure in an expensive Eastern suit, whose presence sent whispers rippling through the assembled crowd. "That's Thomas Whitmore," Hector murmured, leaning close. "Lawyer from San Antonio, represents the territorial orphanage system." The information settled in Caleb's stomach like a stone. Professional legal opposition meant someone had been working behind the scenes to prevent this adoption, investing time and money in separating him from the children he had come to love. He glanced at Martha Hendricks and saw the satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Judge Crawford called the proceedings to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. He was a lean man in his 60s, his face weathered by years of circuit riding through the harsh Texas territory, his eyes sharp with intelligence that missed nothing. He reviewed the paperwork before him with meticulous attention, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal that seemed to contain the fates of everyone who passed through his court. The initial testimony proceeded smoothly enough. Sheriff Bellamy recounted finding the children and confirmed their desperate circumstances, his gruff voice carrying unexpected tenderness when he described their bravery in burying their father alone. Miss Crane spoke of their academic abilities and their positive adjustment to school life. Hector testified to the changes he had witnessed in Caleb since the children's arrival, the way the ranch house had transformed from a bachelor's quarters into a genuine home. Then Thomas Whitmore rose to present his case, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted perceptibly. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth with practiced authority, "while Mr. Thornton's intentions may be admirable, we must consider the welfare of these children above all else. A bachelor household, however prosperous, cannot provide the structure and guidance that young minds require. The Texas State Orphan Asylum offers trained supervision, proper education, and the moral framework necessary to produce upstanding citizens." Caleb's hands clenched in his lap, but he forced himself to remain still. This was not the time for displays of temper, however justified they might feel. Whitmore continued for several minutes, painting a picture of institutional care that bore no resemblance to the grim reality Caleb had experienced in his own childhood. He spoke of dormitories and classrooms, of religious instruction and vocational training, of children prepared for productive lives as servants and laborers. He did not mention the cold, the hunger, the casual cruelty that flourished wherever children were treated as problems to be managed rather than souls to be nurtured. When the lawyer finished, Judge Crawford turned his sharp eyes toward Caleb. "Mr. Thornton, do you wish to respond to these concerns?" Caleb rose slowly, aware of every eye in the courtroom fixed upon him. He was not an educated man, not trained in the art of persuasion that lawyers wielded like weapons, but he had truth on his side, and that would have to be enough. "Your Honor," he began, his voice rough with emotion he could not entirely suppress. 15 years ago, I came to this territory with nothing but a horse and a dream of building something that mattered. I've worked every day since then, sunrise to sunset, and I've built the Circle T into an operation that supports a dozen families. I've paid my debts, kept my word, and minded my own business. But until 2 months ago, none of it meant anything. I was just a man filling his days with work so he wouldn't have to think about how empty his life had become." He paused, gathering his thoughts. These children changed that. When I found them standing under that oak tree, brave and broken and determined to survive, something woke up inside me that I thought had died a long time ago. I made them a promise that day that they wouldn't face the future alone, and I intend to keep it. Judge Crawford's expression remained unreadable. "And what qualifies you to raise 2 children, Mr. Thornton?" "Nothing," Caleb admitted. "I've never been a father. I don't know the first thing about raising children properly, but I know what happens when nobody wants you, when you're just another mouth to feed in an institution that sees children as burdens. I spent 3 years in a place like the one Mr. Whitmore is describing, and it nearly destroyed me." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Caleb pressed on. "These children have already lost everything once: their mother, their father, their home. Taking them away from the first place they felt safe since that oak tree would break something in them that might never heal. I'm asking you to give us a chance, Your Honor. Let us prove that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up day after day and choosing to love someone even when it's hard." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then Judge Crawford turned to the twins, his voice gentle in a way it had not been throughout the proceedings. "Children," he said, "I need to hear from you directly. What do you want?" The courtroom held its breath as Lily and Lucas rose from their seats beside Caleb. They moved to stand before Judge Crawford's bench, their small figures dwarfed by the imposing furniture of justice, but their postures straight with a dignity that belied their years. They had faced harder things than a judge's questions. They had buried their father with their own hands and survived alone on the unforgiving prairie, and that experience showed in the steadiness of their eyes. Lily spoke first, her voice clear and unwavering. "Our papa was a good man, Your Honor. He worked hard every day to give us a life, and when he knew he was dying, he spent his last breath telling us how to survive without him. He said the world could be cruel to children who had no one, and he made us promise to find someone trustworthy and hold on tight." She glanced back at Caleb, something fierce and protective in her young face. "Mr. Thornton is that someone. He didn't have to stop when he saw us under that tree. He didn't have to stay the night or bring us to town or fight for us the way he's been fighting. But he did all those things, and he keeps doing them every single day. Lucas stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility he had shouldered since his father's death. I was angry at first, he admitted. Angry at Papa for dying, angry at God for taking him, angry at Mr. Thornton for trying to help when nobody asked him to. I thought if I didn't let myself trust anyone, I couldn't get hurt again. He paused, his jaw tightening with the effort of speaking truths he had kept buried. But Mr. Thornton didn't give up on me, even when I was difficult. He just kept being patient, kept showing up, kept proving that his promise under the oak tree wasn't just words. Papa always said you could judge a man by his actions, not his speeches. By that measure, there's no better man in this territory than Caleb Thornton. Judge Crawford listened with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. When Lucas finished, the old jurist leaned forward, his sharp eyes moving between the children with searching intensity. The asylum Mr. Whitmore represents could provide you with education and training, he said carefully. You would be among other children your age, supervised by professionals who specialize in caring for orphans. Are you certain you would prefer to remain with Mr. Thornton, a single man with no experience raising children? Lily's response was immediate. Those places are for children nobody wants, Your Honor. We're not nobody. We're Harpers, and now we're Thorntons too, if the law will let us be. Mr. Caleb wants us, not because he has to, but because he chose to. That makes all the difference in the world. The simple eloquence of her words seemed to affect even the stone-faced lawyer from San Antonio. Thomas Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident expression faltering for the first time since the proceedings began. Judge Crawford sat back in his chair, his weathered fingers steepled before him as he considered everything he had heard. The silence stretched painfully, seconds feeling like hours to those who waited for his verdict. Caleb found himself praying for the first time in decades, wordless pleas directed at whatever power might be listening, begging for the chance to keep the family he had never known he needed. Finally, the judge spoke. I have presided over many cases involving the welfare of children, he began, his voice grave with the weight of his responsibility. In most such cases, the law provides clear guidance, and my role is simply to apply it. But occasionally a situation arises that reminds me why judges are granted discretion, because the law, however wise, cannot anticipate every circumstance that human hearts create. He looked at Caleb with eyes that seemed to see past the surface, into the depths of character that defined a man. Mr. Thornton, you came before this court with no credentials, no training, no obvious qualification for parenthood. By conventional measures, you would seem an unlikely candidate for guardianship of two vulnerable children. Martha Hendricks smiled triumphantly, clearly anticipating the ruling she had worked so hard to achieve. But Judge Crawford was not finished. However, he continued, I have learned in my years on the bench that the best parents are not always those with the most impressive credentials. They are the ones who show up, who make promises and keep them, who put the needs of children before their own comfort, who build families not from obligation, but from love. The judge's gaze swept across the courtroom, taking in the assembled witnesses, the opposing lawyer, the busybodies who had come seeking drama. What I have witnessed today is not a bachelor seeking to satisfy some selfish need, but a man transformed by the unexpected gift of children who needed him. And more importantly, I have seen two remarkable young people who have endured tragedy that would break many adults, yet who stand before me with courage, clarity, and a fierce devotion to the man who answered their father's dying prayer. He picked up his gavel, holding it poised above the bench. It is therefore my judgment that full guardianship of Lily and Lucas Harper be granted to Caleb Thornton, with a recommendation that formal adoption proceedings be initiated at the earliest opportunity. The gavel fell with a crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lily let out a cry of joy and threw herself into Caleb's arms, Lucas following an instant later, and suddenly the chamber erupted into chaos. Cheers from supporters, protests from Martha Hendricks, the general commotion of a community witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Through it all, Caleb held the children close, tears streaming down his weathered face without shame. He had not cried since his own childhood, since the dark days in the orphanage when tears were a luxury that invited only mockery and abuse. But these tears were different. These were the tears of a man who had found redemption in the most unexpected place, who had discovered that the empty spaces in his heart had been waiting all along for two brave children to fill them. "Thank you," he whispered, though whether he was speaking to the judge, to God, or to Samuel Harper's spirit watching over them all, he could not have said, "Thank you for giving me a family." Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun blazed down on a world that had shifted on its axis. Nothing would ever be quite the same again, and for the first time in his solitary life, Caleb Thornton was grateful for the change. Spring came early to the Texas Panhandle that year, bringing with it wildflowers that carpeted the rolling hills in blankets of blue and yellow and purple. The Circle T had never looked more prosperous, the cattle fat from winter feeding, the horses glossy with health, the ranch house alive with the sounds of children's laughter, and the warmth of a family that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. Caleb stood on the porch in the early morning light, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. Behind him, he could hear Lily helping Cookie with breakfast, her voice bright with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. From the direction of the stables came the sound of Lucas talking to the horses, the boy having developed a genuine gift for the animals that had made him invaluable during foaling season. 6 months had passed since the courthouse ruling, and the formal adoption had been finalized just 3 weeks prior. The paperwork now sat in Caleb's desk drawer, legal confirmation of what his heart had known since that September afternoon beneath the oak tree. Lily and Lucas Thornton, the documents read, and every time he saw those words, something swelled in his chest that he had learned to recognize as joy. The changes in the children had been remarkable to witness. The hollow wariness that had shadowed their eyes in those first days had gradually been replaced by the natural brightness of youth restored. Lily had blossomed into a confident young girl who excelled in her studies and had begun teaching Cookie's kitchen garden to produce vegetables that rivaled anything in the county. Lucas had grown several inches over the winter and had developed a quiet authority among the ranch hands who treated him with the respect due to a young man learning to become a cattleman. But the changes in Caleb himself had been perhaps the most profound. The hard edges that had defined him for decades had softened, worn smooth by the constant presence of children who needed him to be more than he had ever been alone. He smiled more easily now, laughed more readily, found pleasure in small moments that he would once have overlooked entirely. The bottle of whiskey that had been his nightly companion sat untouched in the cabinet, replaced by evening readings and card games and conversations about everything and nothing. Today marked a special occasion, though the children did not yet know it. Caleb had been planning this for weeks, coordinating quietly with Hector and Cookie to ensure everything would be perfect. After breakfast, he gathered Lily and Lucas on the porch and told them they were taking a trip. The ride to the Harper homestead took most of the morning, the familiar trail winding through landscapes that held different meanings now than they had 7 months ago. When they crested the final hill and saw the cabin below, the children grew quiet, their hands finding each other instinctively in the gesture that had become their signature comfort. The homestead had been maintained in their absence, Caleb having hired a local family to keep the property from falling into complete disrepair. But it was not the cabin they had come to see. They rode past it without stopping, making their way to the massive oak tree that spread its branches over the gentle rise where Samuel Harper lay at rest. The grave had been tended as well, the wooden cross replaced with a proper stone marker that Caleb had commissioned from a craftsman in San Antonio. The children dismounted and approached slowly, reading the inscription that honored their father's memory with simple dignity. Samuel Harper, beloved father, faithful servant of God. His children were his legacy. Lily knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the carved letters, while tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Lucas stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his own eyes bright with emotion he no longer tried to hide. They had learned on the Circle T that tears were not weakness, that grief honored the ones we had lost, that it was safe to feel what they felt without fear of judgment. Caleb hung back, giving them space for this reunion with their father's spirit. He removed his hat and held it over his heart, just as he had done on the day they first met, the gesture feeling as natural now as it had felt necessary then. The promise he had made in this very spot had been kept, but standing here, he understood that promises were not single moments of commitment. They were daily choices, renewed with every sunrise, lived out in every small act of love and sacrifice. After a long while, Lucas turned to face him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for bringing us back, for everything." "This is your land," Caleb replied. "Your father built something here, and that matters. When you're old enough, if you want it, the homestead will be yours to do with as you see fit. But for now, it stays in the family, waiting." Lily rose and walked to where Caleb stood, slipping her hand into his with the easy trust of a daughter who had never known a time when he would not be there to hold it. "Do you think Papa knows?" she asked softly. "Do you think he can see how happy we are?" Caleb looked up at the ancient oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the spring breeze, its roots holding fast to the earth where a good man rested from his labors. He thought about fate and providence, about the mysterious ways that broken things found their way to wholeness. "I think he knows," he said finally. "I think he's been watching over us this whole time, making sure his children found their way home." They stood together beneath the spreading branches, a rancher who had learned to love, two children who had learned to trust, a family forged not from blood, but from the fiercer bonds of choice and commitment. The Texas wind whispered through the grass around them, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come, of challenges to be faced and joys to be discovered, of a future that stretched out before them like the endless prairie itself. And somewhere in that wind, perhaps, Samuel Harper smiled down on the stranger who had become a father, grateful beyond words for the promise made and kept beneath the big oak tree. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow I have something extra special waiting for you.